The deep roar of the sea, the cold wind and waves stretching into the dark. This is a story from an age when the ocean was not merely a route, but a force that could change destinies. Imagine the horizon lit by a pale dawn, longships cutting through mist, and the quiet of coastal villages about to be broken. These were not simple journeys. They were events that reshaped lives. Between the 8th and the 11th centuries, seafaring groups from the north began to travel farther and more frequently than before. Their longships moved like shadows along the coasts of Europe, and with each landing came the possibility of sudden, violent change. These voyages brought trade and contact, but they also brought raids, swift, brutal incursions that could turn a peaceful morning into a lifetime of loss. In the hush before an attack, villagers might hear the distant beat of oars and the creak of timber. Then, in a matter of moments, the calm would shatter. Men would scramble to defend their homes, children would cry, and women would find themselves caught between flight and capture. The chaos of those minutes left scars that lasted generations. When people were taken, the consequences were varied and often devastating. Some captives were kept within households, forced into servitude or marriage. Others were marched to markets and sold as commodities. The language of trade and the language of human life became intertwined in ways that stripped away dignity. To be counted as property was to be reduced to a number in a ledger, a price on a list. Close your eyes and picture a young woman standing at the edge of her village as strangers approach. Her hands tremble, not from the cold but from the sudden collapse of everything she has known. She hears her mother call, but the voice is swallowed by the wind. There is no time to gather memories or possessions. There is only the immediate, overwhelming need to survive. That moment, the split second when a life is altered, is the focus of countless untold stories. Some captives were taken into households where they performed daily tasks, cared for children, and maintained the home. In other cases, they were displayed and sold, moved along trade routes that connected distant markets. The economic systems of the time did not always distinguish between goods and human beings. People became part of the flow of commerce, their fates tied to demand and supply. The sagas and poems of the era often celebrate heroism, exploration, and conquest. They paint vivid pictures of daring voyages and legendary figures. But when we look beyond the romanticized verses, the archival records and archaeological evidence reveal a harsher reality. The same culture that produced tales of glory also participated in practices that caused immense suffering. It is important to hold both perspectives in view, the mythic and the material, the story and the evidence. Imagine a household where a captive woman is given tasks and expected to adapt to a new life. She learns new routines, new names, and perhaps a new language. She may form bonds with other captives or with members of the household, but those bonds exist within a structure of power and control. Even when kindness appears, it is framed by an imbalance that cannot be ignored. There are accounts, fragmentary, sometimes contradictory, that point to the scale of these practices. Traders moved along rivers and across seas, and with them moved people. Markets in distant towns could be destinations for those taken far from home. The routes that carried goods also carried human lives, and the maps of commerce are, in part, maps of displacement. Consider the psychological toll on those left behind. Families who lost mothers, daughters, and sisters faced not only grief but practical collapse. Fields went untended, households lost labor, and social networks were disrupted. The absence of a single person could ripple outward, affecting the survival and cohesion of entire communities. When we read the sagas, we must remember that they were written by particular voices with particular aims. They often emphasize honor, revenge, and the deeds of men. Women's experiences are sometimes relegated to the margins or framed as catalysts for male action. To reconstruct the fuller picture, historians turn to legal codes, burial evidence, and foreign accounts that mention raids and captives. These sources, taken together, suggest that the lived reality was more complex and often more brutal than the heroic narratives imply. There are moments of personal testimony embedded in the fragments we have. A line here, a complaint there, a law that hints at the frequency of abductions. These traces allow us to imagine the human faces behind the statistics. One can almost hear a voice saying, "I was taken. I do not know where my family is. I do not know what will become of me." That voice, whether preserved directly or inferred from context, is the most important evidence of all. The economic logic of the time made captives valuable. They could be laborers, domestic servants, or bargaining chips in alliances and exchanges. The existence of a market for human beings normalized practices that, to modern sensibilities, are abhorrent. Yet within the historical context, such practices were embedded in social and economic systems that rewarded conquest and acquisition. It is also crucial to recognize the diversity of experiences. Not every captive suffered the same fate. Some were integrated into new communities, married, or even rose to positions of relative security. Others endured years of hardship, separation, and abuse. The range of outcomes complicates any single narrative and demands careful, nuanced interpretation. When we confront these histories, we must avoid sensationalism. Graphic detail can re-traumatize and distract from the larger truths. Instead, focus on the human consequences, the loss of autonomy, the rupture of families, the long-term social effects. These are the elements that matter when we seek to understand the past with empathy and clarity. Scholars have debated the scale and nature of these practices for decades. Archaeological finds, from burial sites to household artifacts, provide material clues. Written records, including legal codes and foreign chronicles, offer additional context. Together, they form a mosaic that suggests widespread patterns of raiding, capture, and trade in human beings. The mosaic is incomplete, but it is sufficient to challenge any romanticized view that ignores suffering. Think about the children who grew up without mothers, or the elders who lost caretakers. The social fabric of a village could be altered in ways that persisted for generations. Loss of labor could reduce agricultural output. Loss of social cohesion could make communities more vulnerable to future attacks. The human cost was not limited to those taken, it extended to those who remained. There are also stories of resistance and resilience. Some captives escaped, some were ransomed, and some found ways to assert agency within constrained circumstances. Communities sometimes organized to recover members or to negotiate terms. These acts of resistance remind us that even in the darkest situations, people sought to reclaim dignity and connection. When we examine the myths and the material evidence side by side, a more balanced picture emerges. The sagas tell us about ideals and aspirations. The records tell us about practices and consequences. Both are necessary to understand the full human story. To read only the heroic verses is to miss the lives lived in the margins. To read only the dry records is to miss the cultural meanings that shaped actions. As we reflect on these events, it is important to consider the ethical lessons they offer. Treating people as objects for exchange corrodes the moral foundations of any society. Respect for human dignity must be a constant, not a conditional privilege. The past shows us the consequences when that principle is abandoned. Today, historians continue to investigate, to debate, and to uncover new evidence. Each discovery adds nuance and sometimes challenges long-held assumptions. The work of reconstructing the past is ongoing, and it requires careful attention to sources, context, and the voices that have been silenced. If you wish to learn more, consult a range of materials, archaeological reports, scholarly articles, and translations of primary sources. Reading widely helps to balance the poetic allure of sagas with the sober findings of research. It also honors the complexity of human lives that cannot be reduced to a single story. In closing, remember the faces behind the facts. Empty homes, broken lives, and the quiet grief of those left behind are the true legacy of these events. History is not merely a catalog of deeds, it is a record of human experience. When we study it, We owe respect to those who suffered and to those who survived. Let this account be a reminder that dignity matters across time. The past can teach us about the consequences of dehumanization and the importance of protecting the vulnerable. Share this story with care, and when you do, include the sources and the context so that others can explore the evidence for themselves. If you would like, a list of recommended readings and primary sources can be provided to guide further study. For now, hold these stories with compassion and let them inform how we think about justice, memory, and the human cost of conflict.